just as we struggle to talk about death and dying, we struggle to talk about spirituality, to know what the entry points are and how do we begin to touch that topic. And we're so afraid of offending or embarrassing ourselves or the other person, or that we just avoid, and we deprive ourselves of such richness.
So I'm speaking today with Professor Jane Kuepfer, the Schlegel specialist in spirituality and aging, who works for the Schlegel-UW Research Institute for Aging and Conrad Grebel College in the University of Waterloo. Jane has done extensive work offering spiritual care in long-term care homes, in the community. She's a registered psychotherapist. She's also ordained as a minister in both the United Church and the Mennonite Church. And Jane did her doctoral dissertation in her spirituality and psychotherapy program on spirituality and aging. I had been recommended to get to know you by a few of my colleagues and people that I knew at the university at Grebel as a person that I should really get to know. And so I'm really glad to get to talk with you today and get to just have you share your thoughts with us about end-of-life experience and anything else that comes up. So I don't know, do you want to start out by just saying a little bit more? I don't know if I described your work well, or if you want to give your own bit of a summary there to start out.
Yeah, just to bring you up to speed on what my research is and has been. My doctoral research was with baby boomers. So maybe not people that we think of right away as end of life, but people who are anticipating end of life and maybe just beginning to think about it. So I worked with baby boomers asking questions about spiritual resources as they anticipate growing older, and had some great conversations about how they're navigating these big questions of life, and when their adult lives in many cases have stayed only marginally attached to their religious upbringing. So it's an interesting cohort of people that are entering later life. And then now my research, my most recent research that I've been working on has been with spiritual caregivers in long-term care. So looking at the role of spirituality in late life and how we're supporting it and how we could and should be doing better in long-term care. So that's the different kinds of contexts that I've been working in related to aging and spirituality.
That's awesome. I mean, those are both really interesting to me. I'd love to hear anything about what are some themes that came out of your doctoral research with the baby boomers. What were people really focusing on? You know, were there some high-level themes that came out of that? And then in long-term care homes, I mean, the whole long-term care situation is on a lot of people's radar these days with COVID and the response to that. But of course, it's been a topic that people who work in long-term care homes and who are sort of overseeing things have been trying to bring some of these things to light for a long time. There's a lot more going on in long-term care homes and in end of life than just COVID-19, obviously. But I don't know, do you want to elaborate on either of those areas a little bit more? I'd love to hear anything you want to say about that.
Sure. Baby boomers and themes related to spirituality. There's definitely a rootedness in traditional expressions of Christianity. Most baby boomers grew up going to church, Sunday school, and things like that, but then have gone all sorts of different directions beyond that in their adult lives. And so I saw a lot of openness and desire to learn and explore spirituality, to look at spirituality in different ways, but still some connections. And I think as we see baby boomers growing older, we need to remember those connections to their childhood experience as well, because those roots can be really strong and comforting and inspiring in later life. But then also that openness to explore and to get to know other people and see what their spiritual resources have been throughout life and feed off each other and learn from each other. So that was really interesting. Themes of self, boomers grew up in an era where, or came of age in an era where self-help, self-awareness, self-care, all those kinds of things were something that has been talked about a lot. And so that has some connections with spirituality for them.
Right.
relationships, of course, for all of us of any cohort. Again, that connections piece.
Yeah.
And the space in which they find themselves is also really important, which connects then with long-term care, with residential situations. Where you live, where you are, can really be important to your spiritual well-being and what you have access to, and freedom and privacy and all those aspects.
Just on the baby boomer piece a little bit more, did you find that you encountered anybody? I mean, sometimes I hear about studies about the importance of spirituality and that it's sort of like a nearly universal thing. You know, if you define it broadly enough, that spirituality is something that almost everybody cares about. Did you find people who were sort of saying, you know what, spirituality just isn't really important to me. It's not part of my life that I'm about. Did you find anyone like that? Or?
Well, but the group that I worked with was relatively small. I just spoke with a dozen people in in-depth interviews. So I didn't do a broad survey. And so I'd have to say no, I didn't find anyone. In fact, what I found was people who had never really talked about spirituality in their life, but were just so glad to be asked these kinds of questions.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Especially the men. The men were really hungry for this conversation about what matters in life, what really matters when it comes down to it, and what will sustain you as you get older.
Mm-hmm. I've heard some studies that were done down in the U.S., some fairly large-scale studies about people who in hospital in relation to terminal illnesses, and satisfaction levels that people had with their care, and that a lot of it actually had to do with whether somebody tried to have a conversation about these ultimate questions with them at some point, that was a big part of it for people. So I think that's really interesting.
I think these questions are going on for most everyone, and it's, too often we never broach the topic.
Mm-hmm. That's an odd thing in itself, that this is something that's really important to almost all of us, and yet it's also something that we have a hard time actually bringing to the fore and really exploring openly and talking about. Yeah,
I think we really don't know how. We struggle, just as we struggle to talk about death and dying, we struggle to talk about spirituality, to know what the entry points are and how do we begin to touch that topic. And we're so afraid of offending or embarrassing ourselves or the other person, that we just avoid, and we deprive ourselves of such richness.
Yeah, well, so I guess that in itself already gets us to a little bit of a thought about thinking about end-of-life care and how to improve things, or where to go in a direction. You know, maybe part of it has to do with facilitating more of these conversations, or somehow finding a way for us to be able to be open and discuss these things without some of those fears hindering us. Or I don't know, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree. And I think it begins with becoming more comfortable with spirituality, all of us, no matter what age we are, and maybe defining it more broadly. And so it can be more accessible to everyone. And we know that this isn't something that we're left out of or that doesn't apply to us, but we all find meaning in our own ways. And we don't need to be threatened by differences. It's fascinating to learn what is meaningful for other people. It doesn't mean we have to be the same as them, or that they're going to impose their meaning on us. But there's so many things that we can share with each other and be enriched by. And so much of it can just come through listening to other people and really getting to know people, especially older people in later stages of life, have so many things to share about what has gotten them through life so far.
So Jane, how do we do that? Because it seems like we have a tendency to sort of relegate our aging population to the sidelines, and to sort of have for the most part, mainstream of society is going on over here, and then we've got our aging population in sort of relegated to little spaces that they're not really that visible or interacting very much with the rest of the population. And how do we do that then? How do we kind of broach that?
That's a sad reality, and COVID hasn't helped in isolating us further from our elders. It's harder to communicate unless we have use of technology, although telephones are wonderful. I have had the best conversations with my great aunt who's living in a retirement home. And we just, to take the time and to think about what really matters rather than just the small talk. The time there's so many doorways to walk through into the direction of a deeper conversation.
Yeah.
To ask about things that our elders may assume that we don't care about, but we might. Yeah. Even just as part of storytelling and remembering back when they went through difficult times in life and what helped sustain them. And what's life like now, and not just assuming that everything is great too, and that our elders don't have any spiritual struggles, but to make space for those kinds of big questions like, is God here for me? And why am I living so long? And to hear those and not just quickly say something that dismisses the questions.
I don't know if you want to shift over a little bit to talk to us a little bit about the long-term care specific. You were talking about how the space that you're in and the environment, the atmosphere that you're in can have a real impact on your spirituality and the way that you experience those things. And I don't know, do you want to tell us a little bit more about that more recent research that you've been doing and that kind of work?
Sure, yeah. I've realized there's very little information out there about how spiritual care is being provided in long-term care. And so I've done some telephoning and some survey research just to get a sense of what homes are employing a spiritual care provider, someone who specializes and has skills in spiritual care, and how many homes aren't and are trying to provide for the spiritual needs of their residents without this skilled person on staff. So I'm finding that really interesting.
Yeah, because then who's making the decisions if they don't have a skilled person? Who's is that just the general program manager or something like that, or?
Usually someone whose training is in recreation.
Okay.
Yeah, spiritual care kind of gets slotted under recreation, and it's generally been provided by phoning some local churches and seeing if some volunteers will come in and do a service once in a while. And of course, none of that's been happening during COVID because we can't have people coming and going. So much of spiritual care has gone by the wayside for those. It's my research showed about 51% of homes don't have someone employed. 49% do and 51% do not in the homes that we contacted.
And thinking of that just in light of the reality that these things are so important to people, and yet for some reason we're not tapping into that particular set of needs or that side of things.
I would love to see more well-trained spiritual care providers in long-term care so that there's someone there, because not everyone has family, and in a time of a pandemic, things like that, you can't have the same contact with family, and you need somebody to be there and to look after more than your body. To be listening and accompanying you through these important transitions of life.
Let's say that you're in a long-term care, you find yourself in a long-term care home, and your understanding of spirituality and meaning making and ultimate questions is rooted in a particular faith tradition that you hold to be very important. And given that we're in a pluralistic society where you have people coming from very different places, how does one navigate that, as a spiritual caregiver? That's
a really important question. And I think traditionally in long-term care, where we've provided for spirituality for people by trying to hire a retired minister from town or whoever might be available out there, we've had that kind of situation where the spiritual care might be being provided, but it's not really accessible to everyone, and not. So people who are providing spiritual care should really be well trained in providing inclusive kind of care. But as you said, not just something that's generic, but something that listens for their particular spiritual resources and finds ways to support their particular spiritual resources.
Right.
The particularity can be quite important.
And putting into the mix that the spiritual caregiver presumably has their own particular spirituality and meaning making as well. And I wonder, given that, is there a way to be open and frank about where you're coming from yourself personally, while still making very real, genuine, open, respectful, and edifying interactions with somebody who's very different, or who comes from a tradition that seems to be maybe antithetical to the one that you're working from, or something like that? I don't know.
Yeah, I believe there is. In my experience, it's very possible to support people who follow a different faith tradition if you live with an openness and generosity of faith. That, we don't need to be alienated from each other, especially as end of life nears. And I think we become more and more alike. We're all in the same boat, and the big questions can come with a lot of big mystery. I think there isn't necessarily a lot of answers. Our faith traditions can give us stories, can give us direction, but when it comes to late life, it's more about mystery than about conclusiveness.
So maybe just even a sense of openness to that mysteriousness, or that mystery, is maybe a key part of where to come from there.
Yes, and being able to hold it together and not be alone and feeling like there's just nothing.
I wonder if you could tell us, to just sort of illustrate some of these ideas that you're sharing in a general way, are there any particular stories that you could tell us, or examples of where somebody's doing this really well, something that is inspiring to you personally about the kind of good that can be done in this area of spirituality in relation to end-of-life care?
Yeah, I'm thinking of work in the area of dementia, and being with people. Often we assume that if people are experiencing the brain changes that come with dementia, that they're not there anymore. That they've changed so much that we interact very differently. And I've seen some beautiful work with people living with dementia, around using music, using symbols, using prayers that are familiar, and often those kinds of memories are accessible and are there and are truly comforting. I remember working with one woman who was quite distressed, and we started singing "Great is Thy Faithfulness." She chimed right in, and it turned into a definite time of prayer and connection for her. That she was connected with God, and God helped her that day. And there's just so many examples of that.
That's beautiful. That's really great. I have heard a lot of times people will talk about those who have dementia, and they'll describe it as the person is already gone long before the body is gone. And it sounds like you're countering that a little bit, and I think there's other things that I've heard of that support this a little bit as well. But it is really interesting to ask about personhood and memory, and as these things, as we get closer to the end and we get closer to that mystery, and we're shedding stuff that's been with us in terms of our bodily function, in terms of our memories, in terms of cognitive function to some extent, and yet to what extent are we still there, and can we make life rich and meaningful.
Yeah, and I believe there can be. And there are people who are doing some interesting writing. Christine Bryden in Australia, she's been living with dementia for a long time and is still writing books.
Oh, wow.
And she writes about selfhood and is really tackling that question head on. Like, what does it mean? Are people telling me that I'm no longer myself, or I'm going to lose myself? Like, that's ridiculous. She is herself, and we have the gift of her being able to find ways to articulate that so that we can understand.
As we get closer to the end of our time here, I wonder if there's anything else that you feel like is really important to say about describing where we're at right now. What are maybe the most important sort of challenges that you see? If there's anything still in that area that you wanted to share about, and then I'd like it also if you could tell us a little bit about like what you're doing now and what you'll be up to in the next little while.
I think the main thing that I'd like to say is I just really have hope that our society will become more and more comfortable with spirituality, especially in our later years, and be able to share our spiritual dimension with each other as we grow older, and to understand and value our spiritual traditions and stories, beliefs, and find meaning and belonging to something bigger in the face of mortality and later life, figuring out what does bring comfort and peace and hope. And I think it's important not just to wait till later life, but to nurture spiritual practice throughout life so that we can have those resources as we grow older, whether it's prayer or music, meditation, chanting, sensory experiences that we value, movement things, yoga, tai chi. There's all sorts of different practices that can ground us and inspire us through life, and then they are there for us to bring meaning and comfort as we get into our later years. So we don't want to neglect them earlier in life.
Jane, I'm wondering if you were to imagine somebody who's listening to this and they're thinking to themselves, I don't really have much of a real connection to any particular faith tradition. I don't really even know, what to think about this or how to even start going about exploring my spirituality, trying to understand this. Where can I start? What should I do if find myself in that situation? Are there are there particularly great courses that I could take, maybe taught by you or by others that you know about, or where's a good starting place for someone who wants to start exploring?
Yeah, I think just having an attitude of curiosity to start with is a great starting point, because I think around spirituality, one of our main roadblocks is this reticence to go anywhere near it. So to have a curious mind about spirituality, I think you'll find places and ways to learn all around you. The internet is a great resource for things like that. People are a wonderful resource. If you can learn to approach people with honest, curious, non-threatening questions about their insides, about where they find their strength and what matters to them, and invite people to share that with you, then there's people from all sorts of different faith traditions, and maybe no nameable faith tradition, but people who have practices that sustain them, and especially older people. They've been doing life for a long time. Right. What has their faith practice evolved throughout life?
Jane, I'm really glad to have had this conversation. I think this was awesome. It was really good to be able to explore this particular side of end of life. I know that people that I talk to, we look at a number of different things and issues, but the issue of spirituality is really fascinating. I feel like we have only been able to scratch the surface, but maybe we'll be able to talk some more. And like I said, for those of you viewing this, we are going to try to put some of the resources that Professor Kuepfer can point us to. So keep your eye out for that. And Jane, I just want to thank you so much for taking the time out to do this together, and hopefully we'll be able to connect and explore these topics some more at some point.
Great. Well, you're more than welcome. And thank you.